in the context in which it takes place. And you'll see that context is very important, and as are other aspects of the research process. And also, I just thought it would be really interesting just to talk around my research project, because as Lee said, you know, I only recently completed it, and I feel like it was a really valid subject. And luckily for me, it was a subject that I didn't lose interest in at all throughout. You know, it stayed really pertinent and really relevant. And it had lots of relevance for me as an academic as well. And that's what I also wanted to talk about. So there was much to be learned from it on both, you know, a research level, but also on a personal level. So I just hide that a minute so I can see where I am. The title of my research was What We Came Through to Get Here, the Educational Experiences of Young Somali Women Graduates in London. And that phrase came from an actual interview where I was talking, well, actually it was the end of an interview where I was talking to a young woman, and I was thanking her for taking part. And she said, you know, I was really happy to take part because lots of people aren't interested in this and, you know, what we came through to get here. And she literally said it like that, you know, and I thought, wow, that really summed it up, because this has been a long, difficult journey for lots of these participants, and their experiences, you know, have been challenging along the way. So you'll see that as we go through some of the difficulties that they experienced and they faced in their education. I'm just going to try and look at these 4 key things, and obviously I've got to try and keep to time, so I mustn't talk too much about each one. But I'm going to be talking about my research study and telling you some details about that. And I'm also going to be looking at this issue about outsider research and thinking about what are some of the kind of problematic aspects of it, and really not just about outsider, but also about insider research, you know, the 2 sides of that spectrum. I'm going to be looking at some key issues to consider when exploring outsider research, and then I'm going to do some reflections on my own experience of being an outsider in a research process. I came to this study you know, through my own personal, professional and academic interests in various issues. Studies of educational inequality particularly is something that really interested me. Oh, sorry, throwing things about. I was very interested in social and cultural capital and their relevance in education and educational achievement. I've always been interested in, I say, educational inequalities, and that also relates, of course, to gender, class, ethnic backgrounds, ethnicity, as well as different other cultural status, you know. So it's something, these things all tied together here, really. Oh, is that me making that noise, or does somebody need to mute? Just quickly checking before I carry on.
Keep checking it. I think it might be something on your desk. Is it possible?
I don't know. It sounds like a great wind blowing through my room, but is that, I don't know if that's better. Is that better?
Yeah.
I'll try again. I was really interested in Somalis in diaspora for lots of reasons, and particularly as I was interested in, you know, issues of social and cultural capital and inequalities and different ethnic minority groups and their successes and failures in education, let's say, or challenges in education. And this was a particularly personal issue to me in some ways, because during the 1990s, my daughter was in primary school, and I saw alongside different other migratory groups, you know, there was a big movement of Eastern Europeans into the UK. And then following that was a much greater presence of Somalis in education, primary education. And as she moved through primary and secondary education, they became a much more visible group. And I'm interested in East Africa for lots of reasons, personal reasons, previous studies that I've done in anthropology, looking at East Africa. So I was kind of knew about the history of Somalia. I was very interested in it anyway. And, you know, here was this population that, you know, I was interacting with on a personal level, and me and my family and so on. But also what began to emerge academically was this story about educational underachievement of Somalis. And that's a really interesting story that I was looking at and became aware of. And, you know, if I can just tell you a little bit about that. So what were the statistics on education underachievement? Well, firstly, starting with the bigger social picture, in 2009, Somali-born migrants were suggested to be one of the groups with the lowest employment rate in the whole of the UK. And there was a high degree of economic inactivity and unemployment amongst Somalis. So that already was affecting their kind of social disposition. In 2008, about 32% of Somali men and 84% of Somali women in the UK were economically inactive. And that's compared to a figure of an average figure of about 6% for Britain overall, basically. And then looking more closely at educational statistics, Somalis were seen to be a very underperforming group. Alongside Bangladeshis and Turkish pupils, they were seen in 2010 by Strand et al. To be one of the lowest performing groups in the UK, particularly in London, where most Somalis are situated. So, you know, that was seen to be a major issue for them. And, sorry, got it, sorry. There were quite a few studies that looked at this issue. The Learning and Skills Council did studies around young Somalis in further and higher education. Again, difficulty accessing that particular educational level. Demi, Lewis and McLean, who were from the Lambeth Research and Statistics Unit, they did studies from, they did a study of 10 London boroughs. And they said at that point in 2007 that Somalis were one of the lowest performing ethnic groups, with only 34% achieving 5 GCSEs at grades A to C. You know, I could go on and on about that. It was seemed to be a huge problem. But yet, over the kind of 5 to 10 years, as I moved from further education to working into higher education, I began to see young Somalis coming through the education system and doing well and achieving. And, you know, particularly in higher education, there was a very increased visibility of them. So I was kind of interested in what was happening there. What was this change that was taking place? Because clearly they were, you know, going against the grain of what these educational statistics suggested. They were achieving. I should say something, sorry, about why were they underachieving. I obviously should talk a little bit about that. And obviously there were the obvious issues of language barriers, discrimination, both in getting employment, as well as a lack of social capital, a lack of familiarity with the education system. These are not uncommon factors for recent migratory groups. So the fact that they were struggling early on in these early days of migration were not surprising. In addition to that, the reason that this Somali migration took place was because of the, you know, the war and the disruption and the lack of infrastructure in Somali society that went on from the 1990s onwards. There's been a huge civil war raging in Somalia. There's been a lack of stability, and many of them came from this difficult experience of displacement, forced relocation. Like I said, many came as refugees, and that comes with its own issues. but also, like I said, discrimination, stereotyping, and so on. These are things that, you know, young Black people face in the education system. Institutional racism, both in education and employment. So it was a complicated picture. And, you know, there was a number of studies that were focusing on this. And I was really concerned to look at, like, what is the changing picture? How can we look at this through a more positive lens? What is this shifting landscape that we're seeing in front of us? And I wanted to really present a counter discourse to this deficit discourse that I felt was permeating the educational research. So I came up with these key kind of research questions. I wanted to look at what were the challenges that were facing this group. You know, and they were a marginalized group, both in education. I could talk more about employment, housing. You know, this group have been highly marginalized in the media, this population. So I wanted to look at what were the challenges faced by this group in education and the strategies that they were using, but that were used by themselves and their communities to overcome these challenges. I was also keen to explore the education experiences, like what were their education experiences like, depending on when they came in, what had been their previous experience, what was it like coming into the, you know, the English education system. And I wanted to go and look at the strategies and enabling factors that contributed to their academic success. And lastly, what I felt was really important, and this was something that emerged as I began to do the research, was that I wanted to look at the interaction of culture, gender, and identity pertaining to this particular population. You know, these are women from what tends to be a quite patriarchal community, traditionally quite patriarchal, at least definitely back home in Somalia. Their mothers would have been, you know, not very present in the economic workplace, let's say, for example, possibly not present in school. Female participation in Somalia, even today for young women, is fairly low. It's also, like I said, a society in Somalia that, you know, that there wasn't loads of schools. There was a big agricultural population, so schooling was not high on their agenda necessarily. Well, pastoral and agricultural. Obviously, people lived in the cities and in Hargeisa, Mogadishu, they would have more likely gone to school, boys and girls. But even then, girls, as in many parts of the world where, you know, people face high levels of poverty and so on, there's a tendency for girls to drop out of the education system sooner. So their parents themselves would have had quite disrupted experiences of education. And that was really interesting to me because, you know, how were they making this transition from quite a difficult set of circumstances into the UK, into the education system, and as I said, actually succeeding and achieving. So I was really interested in that, and I was very interested in the concept of gender and how that impacted on their experiences. I won't go into too much depth here, but just to say that there hadn't been much research done in this area. Like, they'd looked at young Somali students, and there'd been some work done with Somali families trying to support young people in education, but there hadn't been any other previous studies of young Somali women graduates. So I really was taking my research ideas from this wider domain, and some of the influences on that were people like Heidi Mercer, who looked at Afro-Caribbean women, both in schools in 1992 in her book Young Female and Black, as well as Race, Gender and Educational Desire, which looked at Black women in education and higher education. I used a lot of ideas from researchers who've looked at the South Asian community, because they've gone through a similar kind of process of change, which involved, you know, quite a rapid transition into UK society, you know, different types of kind of interrelationships with the education system, as well as a strong Islamic religious backdrop to their lives. And so some of the researchers I looked at for that were Sharminda Thakur, looking at gender, ethnicity and political agency. And further down here, Bagley and Hussain, Madood, Shahdwar Madood, they all looked at Bangladeshi and Pakistani young women and their issues of social capital, and not just men, not just women, but men as well, acquisition of social capital, ethnic capital, and how migration influenced them. And of course, I was also hugely influenced by the work of Louise Ryan, who used to work at Middlesex University and was one of my supervisors, and her work on migration, gender, and social capital. And lastly, just to say, Kalwant Bhopal and Sharminda Thakur up here, they were both my supervisors, not my supervisors, my external examiners, and their work was hugely influential to me, and Kalwant Bhopal particularly looking at white privilege in the academy. Oops, I don't know why Kawat Abdi, yeah, as well jumped in there. She did some really amazing work looking at Somali diaspora and identity, shifting identities. I'm just going to say a tiny bit about my research lens, and you'll see why that is important in this outsider research framework. Firstly, my research was framed through a feminist and an intersectional lens, which foregrounded women's experiences. I used an interpretivist model of data collection and data analysis, which very much focused on how, the rich lived experiences of the participants. And it was all underpinned by critical race theory, which really acknowledges the role of racism in education and other important institutions, institutional racism, in fact, you could call it. So that was very much underpinned my approach to looking at the experiences of these Black Muslim women in the UK education system. I used in-depth qualitative interviewing technique. Most of my interviews were between 1 hour and 15 and 2.5 hours long. They were very long. And that was normally because the participants had just a lot to say, a lot to talk about. And I explored these kind of key themes. I kind of had a section on demographics, educational experiences, generally about how they had progressed through the education system, transitions into different levels. And there was a whole section I asked them about their home and family support, the challenges that they faced, and lastly, about their identity and aspirations and what they felt they'd achieved through education and how it impacted on their identity, really. So my participants started out speaking to 7 key informants. They were 7 key people in the Somali community in North London, pretty much, actually. Faisal to me, that was in Tower Hamlets. And so there was a couple actually outside of North London, but I kind of picked these key people, and they proved to be really, really important to me in the end, particularly 2 of them, because they became links to other participants. It's really important to recognise here that I wasn't allowed to interview Middlesex University students or anybody that I'd ever taught or had any interaction with. So I had to go out into the field and find participants. And I ultimately ended up doing 20 in-depth interviews with young Somali women, aged 21 to 30, that had all been educated in in London universities. And they were a mixture of graduates, postgrads, some of them were doctoral students, some of them were studying master's degrees. They were a whole range of different, postgraduate experiences. And I used these purposive and snowball sampling techniques. And like I said, 2 of my key informants, one of whom was a mum who introduced me to her daughter. And that daughter became a really important person for the snowball, for helping me link into and find other young women who were happy to speak to me. And one of the key informants was a researcher in a London university. And she also was really important in, she gave me names of a couple of people that she knew through different Somali organisations, and they then went on and asked other people they knew if they would be happy to be interviewed by me. So why was it interesting to, think about outsider research? Well, I was an outsider. I was a white woman academic researching a marginalised group of young Black Muslim women, and that is, and Somalis, and that is, that is not familiar to me. That's not my culture or milieu. That's not where I grew up. So I was an outsider, and it was really important that I could recognise the importance of this in my research process. And not only that, I was keenly aware, and my supervisors, helped me to think critically about it throughout, because when it came to my Viva, I was called to defend this very strongly. So it was really important. It was really important. I had thought a lot about it. And like I said, my supervisors highlighted it for me, but the examiners particularly focused on the ethics of myself as an outsider approaching this group. And so I really had to strongly defend it, I would say. But, you know, I don't mean that in a defensive way. I had to think very carefully about it. What are the dilemmas that we might face? Well, there are diverse arguments put forward about insider and outsider research. Often these discussions are on the basis of, you know, characteristics of gender, ethnicity, class, or professional status, let's say. These have all been discussed over the years, you know, who gets to interview who, for what purpose, how is research approached in this way. And, you know, some people have suggested, for example, that an insider might be able to access more valid data, allowing for greater insight and empathy. And even Oakley back in the 1980s suggested that women interviewing other women might enjoy a greater rapport. They might get richer data out of the interview process. Others suggest that, you know, outsiders' motives might be questionable and might result in distrust and hostility. And whilst insiders' familiarity might mean that they're more in tune with the experience of their participants, might be more apt to ask the right sort of questions, have a greater understanding and rapport, which generally is seen to lead to richer data generally, especially in qualitative research processes. Shah in 2004 suggested that a social insider is better positioned as a researcher because of his or her knowledge in the relevant patterns of social interaction required for gaining access and making meaning. And there's some validity in that. There has been, you know, studies that have looked at, particularly in the area of health, where they were doing health research, where male researchers might find it more difficult to get frank and honest answers from women about health issues. You know, so there is some truth in this, that insiders might have a different, you know, ability to elicit information. Loads has been written about this. Gunaratnam's written a whole book about, you know, race, you know, exploring race and exploring race in research. And, you know, she argues that while on the one hand, insider status might enable access to more valid data, it might also be that insiders are too close to the subject matter, and therefore participants might not feel that they can be as frank about the issues because the researcher is too involved and too included. Bhopal noted a similar thing, that researchers might take things for granted, forget to ask certain questions because they are insiders. And on the side of the outsider, we could also argue that distance from the research might in fact encourage some disclosures. Participants might feel it easier to discuss the more complex issues of their lives with researchers who are outside of their cultural milieu. But really, one of the things that's important here is thinking about what kind of outsider you represent, if you see what I mean. And in order to look at that, one of the things we need to address is, you know, gender. Well, one of the things is gender, one is class, and one is status. With status comes a set of power relationships between researcher and research, and those two can impact on the research process. So, for example, Bhopal suggests that we should enter into research in a non-hierarchical, non-exploitative way. And she argues that whether you're outsider or insider, if you work on a participatory model in which the researcher shares their biography with the research, you are going to get what is more reliable and richer data, just purely through that transparency and openness. And I felt strongly that that was really important. And from the very beginning, I worked hard to emphasize to the participants, even at the very point of contact, what my research interest was, why I thought it was important. And I hoped that that would enable them to see some level of connection between like their experiences and how I felt that those experiences could contribute to a greater research picture. Trust is a crucial aspect of a participant-researcher relationship, and it is developed through openness, transparency, authenticity, and empathy. And these are all things that one can demonstrate through early communications with participants. So even as an outsider, I think that you can build up important links with participants through these different strategies, really. Bhopal also argues that all qualitative research is predicated on establishing personal, moral, and political relationships of trust. And these features are integral to effective qualities in an effective interview process. So I think it's really about researchers looking deep inside themselves and thinking about, what am I here for? What is it I hope to get out of this? And obviously a really important part of that is reflexivity, which is now seen to be integral to any research process. Even science researchers are asked to be reflexive about why they're undertaking research and how they approach that research and in, you know, in what way. So I'm just going to ponder here on these three issues: reflexivity, positionality, and knowledge. So reflexivity is understood to be integral to any research process, and Ryan and Golden argue that that reflexivity involves honesty and openness about how, where, and by whom data were collected, and that reflexivity allows us to locate the researcher as a participant in the dynamic interrelationship of the research process. Reflexivity encourages us to ask questions about how our personal biography shaped the research process. And it also means taking a critical look at one's own lived reality and experiences, including how your biography affects the research process. And in a topic such as mine, where I was addressing issues of racism, discrimination, exclusion, this meant that I had to not just interrogate myself as a researcher, but also as a practitioner in what I do and how I enact, you know, this. How do I enact my anti-racism in my life as both as a practitioner and as a person in society? These were all really important, and it wasn't, you know, it's not always easy. It's something that people struggle with, but it is really important that, you know, one does that, especially when the underlying concepts of your research are based in social justice. It's really important that you kind of shape the research, you know, you understand how your biography shapes that process. I'd just like to say at this moment that I'd much rather be all in a room together. It's very hard. I do feel like I'm sort of talking to myself, but every now and then I check through to check that there are still some people here. So thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for the waves.
Keep going, keep going. It's fascinating.
Thank you. It's an issue that we often deal with at our team meetings, I can tell you. Zoomtopia. So I could talk loads about reflexivity because I had to look at it in great depth and I had to think very deep and hard about it. And it was one of many things that I, you know, came to really engage with and understand in a much deeper level. But really, as I said, you know, to practice reflexivity is to acknowledge that all knowledge is affected by the social conditions under which it is grounded in both the social location and the social biography of the observer and the observed. And that is a quote from Mann and Kelly. And this is particularly relevant in outsider research, where the identity characteristics of the researcher are reflections of existing social structures. And I have to acknowledge that, you know, I work in education and I am part of the authority structures that the women participants have experienced, you know, the discriminations that they face. I am part of that system. So it's really important to recognize these things. Similarly, you know, we need to be aware of the power relationships that play out in the research process. The power is largely in the hands of the researcher who decides what to attend to. But of course, interpretation in itself is a form of power, deciding what it is that we ask, what it is we ask about, what do we do with that information, which parts of the transcripts do we then decide to pull out and make use of and include in our reports. So interpretation is really important. But we shouldn't see power as a one-way process. And again, this comes down to this issue about outsider status, because it is also the power of the participant to decide what to disclose. And that is really important. We need to examine these underlying processes of power and authority as they shift in the research process at all different stages. You know, just to highlight, not all the people that I approached wanted to talk to me. Some of them just completely ignored me. Some of them, they ignored my emails. Some of them just started out a process with me and then stopped it. That was their power to do that. And obviously, as the researcher, I had to accept that that was how things were going to be. But it's really important that we don't just suggest that power, you know, all the power is held by the researcher. Sprague in 2016 suggests there's a risk in stereotyping all researchers as holding power and authority, which premises a chasm between researcher and research that actually may not exist, and understating the power that participants have over the process. She argues that respondents in qualitative research do hold power in that they decide, you know, what questions to answer, how to answer them. It's important as well that, and this goes on into the positionality, in that power again is not just a simple one-dimensional thing, it shifts in positions and places. And that takes us into thinking about positionality, which is also hugely important. Positionality is about who we are, how we position ourselves in different places in society. And again, it's a really important part of any social science research. How am I self-consciously part of this process? And how do I act out my positionality is important. Now, it would be easy to slip into a situation where the researcher and the researched are sort of static entities, holding just one kind of identity characteristic, but of course we don't. We hold multiple identity characteristics, and that's really important to recognize when we're exploring positionality. Ryan explored this dynamic interplay that takes place in research, talking about the shifting boundaries of identity. She says that in research, we need to take account of the multi-layered identities of researcher and participants and the dynamism through which varied dimensions of identity may be enacted during an interview. In her long history of research, investigating aspects of migration, she noted that migration is a site wherein identities themselves become fluid and are constructed and reconstructed. The interview process, she argued, should be understood in terms of the dynamic rhythms of multi-positionalities, allowing researchers to be reflexive about the instability and contingency of empathy and rapport, and how these need to be continually negotiated across layers of power differentials. And what she's essentially saying is that we all enter into the research process with multiple identities and connecting with our participants on varied identity characteristics. So Mercer, who writing in 2008, suggested that we should reject the insider-outsider dichotomy that comes about when looking at, for example, positionality. And instead, we should think about we should argue in favor of a continuum with the two abstractions of insider and outsider better considered as endpoints existing in conceptualization rather than fact. Individuals do not have a single status, but a status set, and identities are always relative, cross-cut by other influences and other differences, and often situational and contingent. And so I've just listed here, you know, about how I was outside of this cultural milieu, but I did connect with the women participants on other levels, as a woman, as a researcher, which many of them were or had been in their graduate studies, and now in their in their postgraduate and PhD studies. I was a mother. Not many of them were mothers, about 2 of them had children actually, but I am an ally, and I really wanted to make that very much obvious to my participants, that I highly valued both their contribution to the research process, but also valued what they had achieved, as I did, you know, anyone who succeeded in education, but more so because I was appreciative of the kind of challenges that they had dealt with, that the participants had dealt with and overcome. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, because I'm going to talk exactly about how I did deal with that. This is such a huge issue, and it's almost, you know, another topic in its own right, but underlying this concept about outsider or insider is about whose knowledge is valued. And, you know, when we're looking at these ontological assumptions about what knowledge is and how it's constructed, we need to also think about, you know, the ownership of knowledge production and whose voice is then represented in the final analysis of the data. Like who are we foregrounding here? Obviously, this is my PhD. That is what it is. It, you know, it's a piece of work that benefits me in my life, but it also is intended to be an important representation of a set of voices who are not often heard or represented in research, or even in society at large, really, in any sort of, you know, obvious way. And feminism and interpretivism have allowed for a reframing of the research focus in social sciences, posing these kind of critical questions about whose voices are heard, whose truth we accept, what knowledge is represented and valued, and whose voices will be heard when the research is published. You know, that's really important. So how was it for me? Have I got 5 minutes, Lee, to talk about this?
Yes, yeah, I was going to suggest 5 minutes would be perfect. Yeah, and we'll have time for questions.
I'm going to do a real whistle stop tour. Well, as I said, you know, all of these issues resonated strongly with me, as I was in many ways an outsider. I didn't have full access to the realities of the lives of the women that I was interviewing. Black, British, Somali women. These were all identity characteristics that don't relate to me. But you know, it was a kind of toing and froing process. I approached, you know, my research was underway by the time I began to think about these issues. And really the most important thing to me was that when I reflected on the interviews and how open and frank the women were with me, I have to say that I erred on the side of, you know, those authors that suggest that outsider research might give you a little bit more insight, particularly as I was one step removed from the intricacies of their lives. Yeah, they, you know, I felt that they were able to talk a little bit more closely, sorry, a little bit more openly about things that they were experiencing. So, for example, one of the things that we talked about was what it was like to be a woman in, you know, in their families, in their communities, and how they felt sometimes constrained by gendered roles, how they sometimes felt like that was something they had to really fight against, was the freedom to stay in education, to stay particularly in postgraduate education. So I felt sometimes that they felt they could be more open with me about that because I wasn't part of their close local family networks, for example. I did need to have close introspection throughout, and I really had to carefully examine all the processes, the way that I communicated, the methods that I used, the questions that I asked and how I asked them, and how I responded to the participants in various things. I needed to articulate my lens as well. And that's why earlier on I talked about my research lens. This proved to be really most useful. The theories and approaches that informed my work really provided a foundation with their critical, emancipatory social justice models that underpinned my research and my practice. That was really important to me, because if I could stay open and transparent about that, that was a huge level of connection with my participants, because they too were interested in these things. They had critical faculties about education. They were keen to see education as having, liberatory potential, the potential to increase social mobility for them and their communities. They saw it as giving them a sense of freedom, even within their own family structures, allowing them space to develop professionally, academically, politically, to engage with the world in a way that they might not otherwise have done. So we could link on all these points, and the lens in that way, this research lens, this theoretical lens, allowed me to make threads of connection with my participants and proved to be really important. I was also really, I shouldn't say surprised, but they were also very articulate about their position in society. They were very articulate about, frequently about the discrimination they'd experienced. They used the language, the political language of like intersectionality, of discrimination, of institutional racism, microaggressions. They were very, these participants were very savvy and very in tune with their own experiences and what they had been through. And like I said, I found their willingness to talk to me as a real indicator that there was a shared connection there about the importance of this research and what it had to offer to the wider research sort of landscape. This was important. I approached them with humility, respect, sensitivity to the nuances of their lived experiences. We developed a rapport based on mutual interest in this subject. Like I said, from the very beginning, if participants agree to undertake something like this, which takes them out of their comfort zone, they're obviously got some level of connection there with you. And that was a really heartening thing to me, that they wanted to talk about their experiences. And also it was really important that I valued their role in the constructiveness of knowledge production. And one of the things that I had to do to really emphasize that was to keep their voices very strong in the production of the analysis chapters. So there's lots of quotes, there's lots of personal stories. Those were really important in kind of maintaining the integrity and the voice of my participants. I just had to say a quick thing about voices that Lena, who I see there, constantly reminded me that researchers don't give voice to participants. I was not giving these participants a voice. They have a voice, they have a strong, loud voice, they have a strong sense of agency about their own lives. They are using their agency and their voices to, bring about change in their own lives, in their communities and so on. This work merely gave a platform for those voices and hopefully amplified them in the arena of academic research. That was really important, and it was something that, I felt I had to stay strong to in terms of representing these participants' narrative accounts. So lastly, again, I could talk for hours about these things, but important for researchers to acknowledge positionality. These are one of the ways we can make outsider researcher work. Acknowledge issues of authority and power, recognize, the issues of white privilege. That was really important to me, understanding what white privilege is and how it plays out in the academic world, in the world of research, and in the academy itself. Openness, authenticity, and transparency are all important aspects of outsider research. and thinking about the ownership of knowledge and whose knowledge is valued, and countering the hegemony of, you know, white, male, and just white voices in research, basically, placing the voices of participants at the heart of the research. And as I say, following an interpretive model heightens the importance of constructivist accounts, which were intended to view the research scenario as one in which specific accounts are produced rather than being producers of truth. So again, the importance of a lens as sort of framing outside of research. Not quite sure why this is happening, but acknowledging the power you hold over the research process and being explicit about your role in decision-making processes. The last things I was just going to say, I mean, again, probably could do a whole nother 20 minutes on this. So, you know, there were some really incredible findings, and a lot of them were about the participants' experiences and challenges that they'd faced, how their secondary and primary education, and even their higher education, I should say, was impacted on by their family history of migration, of their collective experience as refugees. These were important aspects of their identity and experience that framed how they entered into the educational arena, basically. They all faced distinct challenges, and they were very open about that. You know, well, I say they, many of the participants faced distinct challenges. Barriers to inclusion, you know, social and economic, poverty, discrimination, lack of social capital, but their families were aspirational in their goals. Many of them valued education, and they used a range of strategies to support their young people to achieve. And that despite, there was a lot that I talked about identity and about their Muslim identity specifically, and how that was framed in today's society, particularly in the kind of post-Brexit era. Despite what the women felt were negative stereotypes propounded about Somalis in the media, they were strongly committed to their heritage and cultural identities. They saw themselves as British Somalis. They were proud to be Somalis, proud of where they had got to despite the challenges. And they were very positive about their goals for the future. So, you know, these were really fantastic findings. I was really interested to find how important they felt were social media in kind of linking young Somali pupils together, particularly higher education students. Somali student societies were really important in building representation in higher education and for building important bonding and bridging social capital, as well as shoring up their sense of self and belonging in that space. Really important issues that have been discussed by loads of, you know, sort of decolonizing researchers. Researchers have been looking at decolonizing higher education, this idea of people having a sense of belonging in that space. And lastly, these women were effectively agents of social change. What was really important was that they talked about themselves as having been through these experiences as early migrants, as early refugees with their parents through these challenging times. And now they were success stories, and so many of them had these varied roles as teachers, as tutors, working in mentoring organizations, running mentoring organizations for young Somalis. Several of them had been researchers on Somali projects for the ONS, for the OECD, people like that, working in mentoring organizations. They had such an important role to play, and I talked about them as pathfinders. They were informally and formally supporting their siblings, cousins, family members, community members in building valuable cultural capital about how to succeed in education, and thus imbuing their community with valuable cultural capital. Well, I can see I did that in a rush. I put it in twice. Okay, I think I've said enough, haven't I, Lee?
I'm just about to intervene and maybe leave this up for a minute, and we can all come off camera. We don't have very long questions, so I'm just going to maybe ask if people have something really kind of burning they want to ask, then unmute and say it as quickly as you can. Let's harvest up any questions or comments, and then let Nicky respond to the ones that she feels she can do justice to. While you're thinking, I'll just reassure Nicky that it's quite unusual to have everyone turn up on time and then not leave before the end, but everyone's still here. So we were here all the way through listening attentively. So who wants to jump in with a question? There was some in the chat box.
We're there.
Yeah, but I'll summarize those for you if no one else wants to intervene and say something live. So, well, just unmute and shout if you do and interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll just tell you one very specific question, which is, you know, who in the entire possible Somali population do you think you captured in your research? You know, was there a particular group, subgroup, demographic group that you got, and therefore a group of people that we can't say anything about? Couple of comments about you know, really appreciating the point about multiple identities and how other people's methods courses haven't really picked up on that. And given that people really appreciated those points, I was wondering just whether you could maybe give us an insight. You don't need to respond, but my question is, you talked about reflexivity and you came across with great kind of insight, I think, into kind of your positionality and the shifting positions between you and different respondents. But I was also wondering whether you had any examples of specific things you did as a researcher rather than just insights you gleaned or understandings that you now carry away from it, whether it actually had any practical impact on what you actually do, collecting data or processing it or framing your research. So those are the kinds of things people have mentioned in the chat. Anyone got anything to throw into the mix before we let Nicky close? Okay, back to you then, Nicky.
Oh, right, okay, thanks for those questions. So was the first question, who in the Somali population do I think I captured and who might not be? Who might not be?
Yeah, Yasemin said Somali people
to.
are from at least 5 parts of East Africa. Oh, Yasemin, go on, shout out.
So, yeah, it's Yasmin. So parts of the community did you interview? So I was just thinking, because you did talk about city folk and you talk about nomads, but you also, but also within the Somali community itself, there are 5 parts in terms of distinct parts, and that's where the Somali flag comes from. So Ethiopia, Kenya, Somaliland, Djibouti, I've forgotten somewhere, Kenya.
Right, I see what you mean. Yeah, I know what you mean.
So in terms of that, quite interesting. So yeah, if you haven't guessed already, yeah, my ethnicity is Somali, and I was very interested in listening to this presentation.
Well, thank you for listening. Well, to be honest, you know, I asked all of them about where their families came from, and it was quite diverse. So there was a mixture, in fact, but I wouldn't say that they all came from within Somalia, but some of them had transitioned into refugee camps in Kenya and Ethiopia, and also some of them had transitioned directly into other countries. So I'm sure you're aware that, you know, lots of people, refugees in all parts of the world don't come direct to their place of settlement, but they might go 2 or 3 steps through. So some of them had even been to Sweden. I had one who'd been to Norway prior to coming to the UK. So what I would say is they all came from within Somalia, but I have to say that they were very diverse in terms of, there were a couple from Mogadishu, there were some from Hargeisa, and I know that even that is very different, you know, very different experience. Also, quite a few of them said that their parents had been pastoralists. So, you know, or definitely grandparents had been pastoralists and agriculturalists. So, and some of them had come straight from those villages, you know,
into a refugee
into the airport and out again, kind of thing. Yeah, do you know what I mean? So there was a great range. And it was something that, it was one of those issues that I thought, you know, shall I focus on this or not? Because similar to the issue of clans, it was something that I thought, if I get too caught up in this, it could be problematic. And in fact, some of the reading that I did suggested that Somalis in diaspora are more united by their common experiences of displacement and relocation in a way that binds them. And of course, I'm sure you're aware of like the anti-tribalism movement, who also, you know, have kind of, sorry, I'm just saying again. But the anti-tribalism movement have kind of tried to play down clans and say, look, here we all are ex-Somalis in diaspora. This is what you know.
Oh, I wasn't asking about clans.
No, but I just
Yeah.
thought that could have been, no, I know you weren't, but that could have been another issue of division I could have delved into. So in a way, I would say that I wasn't talking about Somalis from any specific part of Africa. What I was talking about was Somalis in diaspora. That's probably the best way to answer it. That is their experience. This was not about their experience prior to coming to the UK. It wasn't even about their transition experiences, although they came up in the interview. But their migratory experiences prior to being here. What this was really about was being in diaspora in the UK, in London, in fact.
I think I found it interesting from the education point of view, and that's why I asked the question in the way that you did.
And in fact, it could well have been, but it was just like something that I totally agree with you, but I just could not have room for all of those factors, because I was really interested, because also some of their parents had some education, but some had really none at all. In fact, one of the women herself had no education to the age of 14. She had transitioned into the UK, come here as a refugee at the age of 15, hadn't studied for a year, had just been at home with her family, not sure what to do, and then had like jumped into further education and just gone for it, like done her entry level, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, like bam, 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 having had really very little experience of education herself prior to that. So, you know, they were quite amazing stories. So in a way, it was all those different factors, the complete variation that was interesting as well, because they all had such different experiences of education, as did their parents. It was much more about what was it like to be dumped into the education system here at like 3, 4, 5, 12, 50. You know, that was kind of more interesting to me.
And
so
especially from a I think from prior to the Civil War, it was, you know, quite high levels of education at this point. And then, as you said, refugee camps. And what everything that entailed.
Literally schools were dismantled after you know, through 1990 to 91, 92. So, you know, some children would be going to school and those schools were no longer there because the infrastructure did break down, you know, which was, you know, absolutely, you know, devastating for them. But no, it's a really interesting point, and it is so, I mean, it is so complex, and I did have to
I'd be quite interested. You know, I'm a teacher by trade, and I've been trying to get researchers to look at why we're not getting as many Somali males, for example, in teaching. What is the barrier behind this? But I find very few people, I haven't even got in through the door of trying to get people to do the research with us. Why do you think it's not a research area?
Well, I'd love to talk to you about it further, because you'll see that on my last slide there, which I hopefully you'll be able to do something with the slides at some point so people can see them. But, you know, that issue about representation in all levels of academia is hugely important, I think. And the women that I interviewed said that to me as much. They were like, we need to be seen. Why aren't we being seen in primary, in secondary, in research, you know, in higher education? Why aren't we being represented? And it's such a huge question. And the question of young men as well, because there's a young woman, well, she's not that young anymore. I mean, there's a woman researcher, Muna Abdi. Do you know Muna Abdi? In Sheffield, and of course she's about to publish a book about young Somali men in Sheffield. That's the result of her PhD project. So keep in touch with me, Yasmin. As soon as that comes out, I'll highlight that to you, because I think she would be really interesting. She's doing loads of work around education and promoting young Somalis to get into teaching at all levels, again, primary, secondary and higher. But yeah, Muna Abdi, look out for her.
At this point, I'm gonna have to do that terrible thing of intervene and draw things to a close.
I didn't answer the second question, sorry.
All right, we'll have to wait for part 2 at some point. But what I am going to do though, Yasmin signed up online, so I do have your email. So if you're happy, Yasmin, I'll share that with Nicky. And this feels like phase 2 of Nicky's research might be being born in front of our eyes. I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming. I want to say especially thank you for Nicky. She's in the middle of balancing about 20 million different academic tasks at the moment on a very big, busy course in the middle of a COVID meltdown on campus. And she's made time to kind of revisit her work. I think people have been riveted. You know, it's great.
No,
to
I
see people
really
come to the
enjoyed
end.
it. Thank you all for listening. I'm always really happy to talk about it, as you can tell.
So thank you very much. Yes, one of those funny silent rounds of applause. And we look forward to hearing more, because there are loads more opportunities to talk about these kinds of issues. And of course, we look forward to the publications that will be following shortly from the PhD. So thanks, everyone. Keep an eye out for the next couple of PEP seminars over the next few months. Look forward to seeing some of you then.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everybody. Sorry, Lee, that I didn't answer your question.